Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Ryan Abt. I will be your host today. I go by the username Kugelfang52 on Ask Historians. Today, we're joined by Jenn Binis. She is here to discuss gender, inequality, and rhetoric in American educational history. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Ryan. I'm very excited because I could talk about this topic all day. So I'll do my best out of respect for our listeners to keep it short.
Oh, well, I will enjoy learning about your topic. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to ed history?
Sure. So my background is, first I was a special education teacher. And actually, I was one of those, I'm a very typical American education teacher. Had I stayed in the classroom, I'm in my mid-40s. I'm white. I went to, a semi-suburban high school. I went to a state college 100 miles from where I grew up. So I ended up teaching in a district within 50 miles of where I grew up. So I'm a very stereotypical sort of teacher. And sometime, I think in my master's program, I started to get fairly radicalized around feminism and equity and just general injustices. And from there, I began to get very frustrated with the disproportionality in education in a bunch of different ways. And probably the most pronounced disproportionality in education is that it is a women-led profession in the classroom, but men dominate in positions of leadership. And so as a feminist right out of grad school, I spent a lot of time kind of yelling into the void about this. And so one of the ways I tried to move past just yelling into action was actually through history, to try to better understand the patterns that led to this reality so that I could do what was in my ability to control to interrupt the pattern. And I don't know if I've been nearly successful, but I just started. I am one of the members of the Ask Historians community who is a self-taught historian. I started just reading books. My gateway book, as it were, is called The Teacher Wars by Dana Goldstein. And from there, I just started reading everything I could get my hands on. I did a lot of independent study. I have my PhD work is in special education, so it's not in history. And I am ABD, or all but dissertation. I didn't complete my dissertation because I fell in love with, other stuff. So I had some academic training around getting into self-study, and just started learning from everyone that I could. Learned a lot about historiography, learned a lot about the history of education. Read all the classics, read the foundational texts, and just slowly started to put myself out there in terms of here's what I think I understand. Started to attend conferences. I went to Big Burke, sat in on all the feminism history sessions, and just slowly kind of worked my way into it.
That's great. I think the field of educational history does tend to get a lot of former teachers, but a lot of people from different areas and different arenas, which makes it an interesting field.
Yeah, agreed.
So one of the things that you are currently doing is you are the president of School Marm Advisors, and you chose the name School Marm. What is significant about the name School Marm, and why does it matter? Why does it feature for you?
Yeah. So when I left the classroom, I never intended to leave the classroom. I expected to teach for my entire life. I was fully my intention. But my fifth or sixth, I'm getting old now. I think my fifth year of teaching, there was a lot of issues with my students were getting kicked off the bus a lot. My small group of students with disabilities were constantly getting in trouble. And it wasn't because of what my students were doing. It was because of perceptions around my students. So the way stereotypes work is when we see a person from a member of a group do behavior, we tend to extrapolate that behavior to their identification within a group. So in other words, my children would do something, my students would do something, and rather than seeing them as a 10-year-old boy who did this ridiculous thing, bus drivers were saying, well, they're a special ed kid, they don't know how to do the right thing. So they were treated as if, their disability was their prevailing trait. And as opposed to saying, hey, this is just a 10-year-old child doing what 10-year-old children do. So my principal asked me to do professional development with a group of bus drivers. who were all older men. This is a recurring theme in my life. Talking truth to power. And doing the PD with the bus drivers, there happened to be someone in the room who was starting up a teacher kind of professional development group. And so I became a TOSA, which is a teacher on special assignment, for a couple of years. And that led to me doing professional development. So I then spent 15 years doing professional development with teachers. And that meant that a school would bring me in and I would have a group of teachers and I would work with those teachers. And my area was curriculum and assessment design. So one thing that has happened within the past 15 years is states have become very interested in doing large scale multiple choice tests. They had to because of No Child Left Behind in 2001, but they would do the tests that were required by federal law, but then they kept adding more and more and more tests. And so a parent would call the school board and say, my child has taken 15 multiple choice tests this week. This is bad. And the board would say, yeah, you're right. That's bad. Let's do something about that. So districts would bring me in. I would do what's called an audit, take stock of all the tests that are happening, say, hey, you know what? We can eliminate these 4 tests. Let's take these 3 tests and combine them and turn them into a performance task. So over 15 years, I spent a lot of time giving people feedback, helping adult learners get better at what they were doing. So if a teacher wrote a curriculum plan, I would give them feedback. And about 2 years ago, I started to feel like I was wasting teachers' time. Teachers' time is incredibly precious. Just the sheer amount of planning that goes into being a teacher, when kids aren't in front of you. And I began to feel as if the thing I was talking to the teachers about wasn't what they needed to be talking about. We were talking about multiple choice tests. What students need to be wrestling with now is much, much bigger than just multiple choice tests. So I started to pull back and I created SchoolMarm. And what I do now is I provide editing support. I give feedback to authors. I work with a lot of college professors. I work with doctoral students. I work with teams of authors who are writing manuscripts. And basically, I just apply all the skills that I developed giving teachers feedback to authors. And when I started to do the work, it was kind of like a side gig. I would just do it as favors for friends. And friends were encouraging, you should do your own thing. You think about starting your own thing. And so when I was thinking of names, I ended up falling into a lot of generic sort of names, critical friends or, feedback for you, LLC. And none of them really captured what I wanted to get into. I wanted to explicitly talk about gender. I wanted to explicitly talk about race. I wanted people who hired me to know I have a lens and I'm not going to just read your paper neutrally. I will bring my lens to it. And this is the lens that I bring. I will give you feedback on pronouns. I will use gender neutral language. I will encourage you to diversify your reference list. I will encourage you to cite Black women. This is how I will approach this. And while talking with my husband one day, I said, what I want to be is I want to be everyone's school marm. I want to stand there and say, here's what you need to be doing. And so I went with school marm because it evokes gender. It's clearly a gendered term. It evokes race because school marm emerged in the 1840s as a word to describe a woman teacher. And at the time, it was white women were the predominant members of the teaching force, much like they are now. But it just had that, it's the word that to me, it means I will give you kind feedback, but I'm not going to heap praise upon you. I will, and in the words of one of my heroes, I will get it right and I will keep it tight. And it will be clear and it will be focused through this lens. So it's a word for me that gets at all of the things that I want to offer to people and all of the things that I'm passionate about.
That's great. Yeah, it certainly, you pointed out that it speaks to gender and race. At the same time, there's also that duality in American education where schools and educators reflect society and at the same time are supposed to be reformers of society. And I think your desire to be the school marm of everybody, right? This idea of what the school marm does. Are they a reflection of society, or are they reforming students? Is there anything that you can say about that, or that how school marm speaks to that kind of Janus-based nature of American education?
Yeah, I think what you're kind of getting at is the fact that American education history is going to be filled with tension no matter where we look, because America is filled with tension. And one of the things, one of kind of the other pieces is when people come, to ask historians and they ask questions about American education history, 9 times out of 10, the first thing I have to say is, due to the 10th Amendment, when we talk about education history, it is highly, highly localized because we do not have a national education system. Because the courts have consistently ruled that we do not have a constitutional right to an education. That may change, but that's where we are right now. So I think the idea of a school marm is that it is both trying to reform, because those waves of young women who joined the teaching force in the 1840s and 1820s, 1840s, as the profession was feminized, were doing it in the name of proselytization. They were seeking to convert America's children to the American ideal, which was, of course, shaped in all the other stuff that shaped American ideals, including Protestantism. And so they were, in effect, acting as like de facto missionaries. But instead of preaching the word of the Lord, who sometimes made his way in, though, instead of preaching the word of their church, they were preaching letters and numbers and Americana. So I think the school marm sits in that place between wanting to change, wanting to advocate for change, but at the same time, those young women were very tightly limited by what they could and could not do. So it wasn't until fairly recently, the 1980s, in which it was universal that a woman or a person could teach, be married, have children, and be visibly pregnant. Because when school marm was a popular term to refer to a woman who was a teacher, a school marm could not be married. And if a school marm was married, it was highly atypical. A woman was expected to leave her job upon getting engaged. And if she did, for some reason, become widowed and decided to go back to the classroom, if she had children, teaching was very much not a thing that she would do. So school marm carries with it all of that history related to gender and race and the sexism and the racism and all of that stuff that's kind of combined within that.
So a question on that idea of school marms being, unmarried and all that. How is that? Who was maybe not enforcing or policing that, but was that a push or a pull? Were other teachers wanting to maintain that because it would make more jobs for these younger women, or what?
I think it was a little bit of both, or my understanding of the historical record is that it's a bit of both. It was social norms when it comes to women's behavior are very difficult to negotiate in American history. And so when we're talking about what's the norm, there was incredible social pressure on young women to be the right kind of teacher. And so the reason it shifted for the first part of, and I recognize I'm preaching a bit to the choir as a fellow education historian person, but just to kind of share with our readers, for the first part of American history, from the first arrival of Europeans on this soil, education was very much a masculine trade. Schoolhouses were dirty and they were messy, and the teacher was a disciplinarian. He was associated with a switch. And if children misbehaved, and by children I mean white boys, mostly the sons of men in power, would be beaten. There's no easy kind of way around to say that. So this idea of teaching as this masculine force was associated with the fact that formal education was only available to some. So when the idea that public education is a public good, that we need public education for a democracy, that ideal, those who advocated that, men like Horace Mann and women like Catherine Beecher, when they said, here's what we need, they had to find a teaching force. And there were thousands of young women just sitting around, just not doing anything, or seemingly not doing anything. So there was this workforce just waiting. And in order for those women be able to enter the workforce, the conditions of school had to change because society would not allow a young unmarried white woman to go to a place that was socially unacceptable for her. You just didn't do that. So schools became cleaner. They became an extension of the parlor. They became a place where towns would be proud of their school as opposed to it being just this also ran. So as the numbers of teachers of the schoolhouses went up, the number of teachers went. And so, yes, to a certain extent, teachers would leave because of the social pressure to keep turning over the number of teachers. And when we made that transition, the average salary of the American teacher dropped by a third. So the young women who replaced the male schoolmen were being paid sometimes as a third of what their male colleagues are being paid. And that norm, just to get into current events for a bit, that norm would not be redressed until the 20th century and the rise of the teacher union teacher contract, where for very long periods of time, up until the 1950s, 1960s, a kindergarten teacher would be paid half as much as a high school physics teacher because the high school physics teacher, had a family and he taught high school physics. And she was only teaching, quote unquote, only teaching 5-year-olds. And it took the rise of collective bargaining, it took the rise of teacher contracts to work that out. And just recently, I saw that in Wisconsin, they've lifted collective bargaining. So teachers in Wisconsin now have to negotiate on a teacher by teacher basis. And what's happening is the pay gap is increasing between male and female teachers. Male teachers in Wisconsin are now being paid more than female teachers on average because the stopgap measures that interrupted institutional sexism that are baked into American education history that interrupted that sexism, contracts, collective bargaining, when you pull those out, education, just like America, slides back to that institutional sexism. So today, male teachers are being paid more in a state because we lifted out those things that women had fought for, collective bargaining. So this idea that women teachers could be paid less, but also it was believed that it would be too difficult for a woman to teach and parent and wife all at the same time. So if you're going to teach, teach. If you're going to wife, and then if you're going to also parent, then you're being a mother. So there was a lot of sentiment around the idea of a mother teacher, and it's a compound word, mother teacher, where it was a teacher who was gentle and loving, never yelled, never raised her voice, because what she was doing was preparing to be a mother. And that was how she would raise her children. But of course, there were teachers who would scream and yell at their children and at their students. And there were teachers who were not good teachers. I think at one point, and I've seen different versions of it the more I read about it. But my understanding is that there was one point in Massachusetts in the 1880s that something like 6 out of every 10 white women in Massachusetts had been a teacher at one point in their life.
That's a crazy statistic, but when that's one of the only occupations, respectable occupations, that's available, it becomes maybe more of a norm or accepted and understood norm.
See, I warned you, Ryan. I warned you. I could just talk at length about this stuff all day. So I'll try to be a better guest and not talk for long chunks of time.
No, I appreciate it. I think it's good. I think building that context of women's position in education and also within American society is useful to understanding then some of the other topics that we're going to discuss. And one of those would be that we see all these women teaching, but you mentioned that education was a male dominated field as far as the institution itself, maybe the direction that it was going. So what did that look like? How did men dominate the field if they weren't in the classroom?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Now we think of teaching into administration as sort of a ladder. You teach, you get your admin certification, you perhaps become an assistant principal, and then you become a principal, and then maybe you move into district administration and eventually end up a superintendent. That's kind of how we think about it in the modern era. But for a time, during the rise of the common school, there rose a class known as schoolmen. And these were men, typically white, who would decide what I want to do is lead a school. Some of them did have academic backgrounds, like they went to school to learn how to be a school administrator. Some didn't. Some decided, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be a principal, or I'm going to be a district school leader. Many of them were politicians. That's most common on the East Coast, where a politician would make a lateral move from an elected office to being the head of a school board or a school leader. And it wasn't until the end of the 1800s where school houses started to consolidate into districts. And what happens is, like in many things, when people are creating something new, they look to other fields to get ideas. And what happened is, because the women were doing the work of teaching and men were creating this, and it was seen as women's work, truly is the idea. What teaching had been so feminized that it was literally considered women's work. It's not something that men would do. And we see echoes of that today when, if you know someone who's a man who teaches kindergarten, almost to a person, if a man says, yeah, I teach kindergarten, people will, I'm sorry, you teach kindergarten and you're a man, huh? How surprising, or something along those lines. We still carry along those kind of stereotypes about what is, teaching is women's work. And there's a couple different books that have used that particular phrase, like Women's True Profession is one of my favorite books, which is a collection by Nancy Hoffman. It's a collection of women's essays throughout history about what it's like to be a teacher, which is women's true profession. So as these men were saying, okay, we're going to get common schools, we see the rise of public education coming, let's look to business. And so they used language. Administrator was taken directly from the world of business. And we start to see the rise of, metaphors and analogies. Some men look to the military. There was a popular education movement during the Progressive era called platoon teaching. And what platoon teaching was a school administrator would set up the campus such that children would move around the campus in platoons. So for the first part of the day, Group A or Platoon A would be in the academic classrooms. Then Platoon A would move to outside and they would work in the garden, or they would play, or they'd do arts and crafts. And Platoon B would be in the academic classrooms. And then after that, they would move to the auditorium or music classes. So children would move through platoons. And that language comes directly from the military, sometimes called the Gary Plan. A man named Wirt used that language, but other men created administrators, and they would be the administration who would manage teaching. So the classroom is very much shaped by feminine touchstones and femininity, or perceptions of femininity. And administrators are very much shaped by masculine ideals. We even see this in how labels are used. So sometimes there are still some communities in America where the principal is referred to as Principal Binis. They use the title principal before their last name. But the teachers are never Teacher Binis. It's Miss or Mrs. And to age myself, I'm mid-40s, but I started teaching when you were either a Miss, M-I-S-S, or a Mrs. We actually had to advocate, we being, Generation X teachers, had to advocate for the moniker Miss, M-S, which is a good reminder that history, isn't that far behind us, because it was my mother who marched in feminist, who in the 60s, my mother did that when she was a young woman. But yet I, as a young teacher in the 90s, had to, even the early 2000s, had to fight for a particular kind of language to reflect a more comprehensive, all-encompassing language. So yeah, it's women in the classroom, men in administration, and it's been that way since schoolmen decided they're better at running than they are at teaching. Tongue in cheek.
That's also the period the 1880s through the progressive era. That's the period of the the plans for all the schools, right? You mentioned the platoon plan, but those were very common all throughout the country of men coming up with plans and advocating for them in teachers' journals and whatnot. It's also the Committee of 10, its report. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about what the Committee of 10 is and how it maybe shapes some of what you're talking about?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so, oh man, Committee of 10. All right, so Committee of 10, 1890s. And one of the things I love, and the reason I got into this is because one of the things we love to do in modern American education is people who want to push for change. I call them school change now, like all in capital letters. And I won't name check, but there's a group of actually, I will name check one who's recently passed. Ken Robinson is what I call a change school now advocate. And one of the things he would do is he would say, schools need to change because they haven't changed in 100 years. It's always, anytime anyone ever says that, it's they haven't changed in 100 years. And they were saying that in the 1990s, and they're saying it now in 2020. And what they will do is they will point to the Committee of 10, and they will say, we have to change because the Committee of 10 designed public education to prepare kids to work in factories. And every time someone says that, I want to say, could you provide a citation for me? Like, where exactly in the Committee of 10 report does it say that? So the late 1800s, what was happening is more and more kids were coming to schools. And what happened then, and had happened since 1670, colleges were complaining, and they were saying, you're sending us students who cannot handle college work. Harvard's been complaining since, the first kids walked out of Boston Latin High School to go to Harvard. And colleges were complaining. So what ended up happening is the National Education Association brought together what they called the Committee of 10. And it was 10 men who were running 9 different committees around the country. And each committee was devoted to a different subject: Latin, Greek, modern English, or modern language, English, natural sciences, et cetera, mathematics, et cetera. And what these men did is they went around and they surveyed all around the country, and they said, okay, what does high school look like? What are we doing in the American high school at this moment in time, the 1890s? And they wrote up their findings. And their findings were, this is what we see happening. And they made some recommendations. And their recommendations were things like, when you're going to teach science, don't rely on the textbook. Let kids experiment with stuff. If you're going to teach history, maybe think about teaching using primary sources. Don't just rely on the textbook. If you're going to teach math, don't give kids anxiety about learning math. Let kids play with numbers. Let kids have fun. So this Committee of 10 white men, and all non-disabled, as far as I know, cis, in 1894, wrote this report where they basically talked about what we in 2020 consider to be good teaching practices. Make science fun. Use primary sources. Don't, give kids a math complex. But what they did is they kind of started to set into place the structure of the current American high school, and where they said, for about 40 minutes a day, you should do science. For 40 minutes a day, you should do history. And underlying their report, again, it was both a survey and recommendations. It had no authority at all. There was nothing they could control. So when people say the 1894 designed, no, they just wrote a report and said, hey, we think this is cool. We think this is what should happen. But one of the men who was made aware of this report through the efforts of a man named Charles Eliot, who would become the president of Harvard, Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, depending on your pronunciation, became aware of this report and became aware of this perceived gap between high school and college. And so what Carnegie did is he said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to fund the retirement of college professors, but only real, quote unquote, college professors. And in order to prove you work at a real college, you can only accept students who meet certain criteria. They have to have math and English and social studies and science, and they have to have had a comprehensive liberal arts education. So colleges started to only accept students who met those particular criteria, which meant high schools had to change to meet those particular criteria. And of course, I'm simplifying, 30 years of education history. But the Committee of 10 said, hey, liberal arts are a good thing. And a few years later, colleges said, well, let's bring in students who have liberal arts education. And there we have it. And I think the interesting thing about the Committee of 10 is less what they said then and more how people in 2020 like to use their words. And it was a group of 10 white men. Even the two people representing women's education groups, there was one of the men from one of the Seven Sisters, one of the women's college, and the principal of the Albanese Girls High School was on the committee as well. He led one of the subgroups. And so they didn't even have room for women. They probably talked to some teachers, but not that many. But I just think it's so fascinating that there's that one Committee of 10 report that everyone in 2020, not everyone, a lot of people in 2020 point to and say, this was bad, this was wrong. And I'm like, just read it and you'll see it's not that bad.
But it also does speak to the power of rhetoric, but also of memory, of how we decide to remember it and then pass it down from generation to generation, and that it's used as a foil more than as a actual source or of learning or of really anything. It's something to play your own reform mechanism against.
And it's so frustrating who gets cited as, the leaders in education. I mean, if I ran the world, we would never, ever, ever again talk about that John Dewey would fall away to the annals of history and be forgotten. And instead, we'd be talking about Anna Julia Cooper. And instead, instead of saying, well, I'm a Deweyan educator, we would say, I'm a Cooperan or a Coopertarian, or however you would conjugate that. It's so, yeah, memory, like who we choose. It's a female dominated profession. But if you look at who gets lauded, it's virtually always men. Like when you go to teacher prep colleges, we learn about Vygotsky and Bloom, and we keep hearing about all of these men. We don't hear about Montessori as much. We don't hear about Cooper. It's so fascinating.
Or even when you learn about Ruth Benedict, it's in the context of, oh, she's Frank Boaz's student, right? So that she's still connected to the man who taught her or whatever. I know I've seen that in a number of works that I've read as well. I do have a question about, you've talked about a lot of the gendered language and also men running the institutional side of schools. How did women respond? How did they adjust or combat these systems and this rhetoric?
Yeah, it's a fascinating history, and I think one of the things that's helpful to remember is that when we talk about women, we tend to default to talking about the actions of white women. So pre-Brown v. Board, there were in effect 3 or 4 different collective groups of teachers. So we had the white teaching force, who was very much shaped by Protestantism, which very much was Sylvia in the lane of a woman would teach until she got married, and then she would be a mother because she wouldn't be split. And if she did decide to keep teaching, well, she'd be kind of pushing the norms of her community a little bit. So there was the white women teaching force. There was also an incredibly active and incredibly focused Black women teaching force, many of whom moved to the American South following or during Reconstruction, was paid for by the Freedmen's Bureau. And what they focused on, and many of them were married, many of them brought their families. There are lots of stories of teaching couples who moved south or from the American South. And that's just some of the new stuff that's emerging. I'll set that aside for a second. And these Black women teachers were focusing on many of the same things Black women educators are focusing on today. And it's about teaching Black children both their own history related to Africa, related to America, related to what the beauty and the language of Black American history, but also how to understand the history of white America, to be able to challenge the halls of power at the same time of understanding one's own identity. And so there was also all of the work going on by Indigenous educators who were trying to reconcile what was happening of the genocide of their communities and what did that mean. So if you were a woman, and there is one particular woman whose names we'll have to put it in the show notes, and I haven't heard it said out loud. Ziki, I think is how it's pronounced, but I'm not confident because I still haven't heard it. She's one of the many Indigenous scholars who focused on reframing Indigenous education so that it returned children back to their community. So children who went through these new models of Indigenous education led by Indigenous teachers not only could speak and communicate in English, but could also, so they could advocate on behalf of their communities, they could go back and carry forward the traditions of their ancestors. So we have all of these different groups of educators. So there wasn't just one kind of approach to being, or what one kind of look of a woman educator. There were all these different groups. That changed following Brown v. Board. And with Brown v. Board, we talk about how it was the end of legal segregation. But what it also was an end to these different classes of teachers. And different historians have come to different conclusions. But without using a specific number, it is safe to say that the Black teaching profession was decimated following Brown. Because when states shut down Indigenous-only schools led by Indigenous teachers because they were no longer, quote unquote, legal, when they shut down Black schools, when they shut down schools in Texas that were led by Spanish-speaking teachers and Mexican teachers for Mexican children because they had to merge because they were no longer legal, the people who got fired were the Black, Indigenous, and Mexican and Asian teachers. So white schoolmen were not willing to take onto their faculty teachers of color. If you have to merge a school, the people who are going to get cut are the non-white teachers. And we lost thousands of teachers. An entire generation of Black teachers was simply let go because of Brown v. Board. And instead we talk about how, yes, it was a step forward, but it was a huge step backwards for the diversity of the teaching force. So when we talk about why it is that, the teaching remains such a woman-dominated profession, when we talk about kind of what leads to that, part of that is Brown v. Board, because the ruling said with all due haste. And that idea that it had to be done quickly, which meant it couldn't be done thoughtfully, which meant there were, one of the most kind of stories that has stayed with me the longest was the story of this Black male, chemistry teacher, I think in Georgia. He was a coach of a football team at the Black high school. He taught chemistry to his students. He was an incredibly well-loved, very, very good at what he did. And when districts merged, he was told, well, congratulations, you can now teach, PE class. So yes. All of that knowledge just gone.
The institutional knowledge lost in Brown versus Board integration process. I think you're kinder than I would be in laying at the all due haste, because I know here in Texas where I am, all due haste meant 21 years later in some cases. I think there was plenty of time and forethought given. I think a lot of it had to do with where power lay, and it was in the white school system that the African American and Mexican and other indigenous schools were integrated into, and again established the white school system as the norm, right? Others had to become like or kicked out of, as the case certainly was, or demoted, as you gave in your example of the man who was given a position as a gym teacher. So yeah, I think you could do a whole podcast on that process, and it would be a very good and interesting one. I did want to ask, and you actually got to the topic of Brown versus Board, which something I wanted to ask you about. But that you're bringing us forward to more today. So this is an obvious answer, but do we still see these same power disparities and inequalities in race, gender, and ableism? And how do we deal with those? What do those look like today? What compromises are being made? I think you know with these various groups that you talked about, you know, white women didn't always advocate for, or often didn't advocate for Black women teachers, for example. They often excluded them. And so, are those same types of compromises on race and gender and ableism still being made today? And what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things going on there, and I think um, so. As a first kind of example, I am a huge fan of the 1619 Project that just came out of the New York Times, and the reason I value that particular project is because it centers American history on the Black experience. And one of the things I think happens is we tend to think of American education as having always existed, or when we talk about the creation of American education, we talk about the rise of the common schools in the 1820s up to the Civil War. But one of the things I think we need to remember is that it wasn't until 1975 that American public education was required, that schools were required to educate children with disabilities. So truly, I am exactly as old as American public education. So we only have 45 years of history about trying to design or trying to create truly public education. And the challenge is that we didn't get a fresh start in 1975. If someone didn't hit the restart button, we carried with it all of that history. And so, first, we have with it just the basic physical plant of public education. Most schools were built before ADA, meaning all the accommodations for the teachers and students with disabilities happened after the school was built. And again, this is very different based on where in the country you're talking about. But even today, one of the major concerns with teachers in Boston going back to teach in Boston during the pandemic is the basic physical plant and the terrible air systems in these schools, because these schools were built in many cases during the public works administration during the 1930s, and then during the baby boom in the 1950s. So we have very, very old schools. So we're starting off from a place where children are going to schools in buildings that were not designed to be universally accessible to all human bodies. We're going to schools where children are experiencing hard gender coding related to bathrooms, related to how people are addressed. So we're carrying with us all of this history in our language, in our curriculum, and just how teachers are organized. We carry with us all of these Protestant touchstones where children raise their hands to talk. And on one hand, we can say, well, that's a good thing. You don't want to talk over each other, but it's not a universal human norm. Children can learn how to watch for body signs, to use verbal cues to indicate that they want to talk. It's not always having to raise their hand and wait for permission. So when we think about how all of these things were still being carried, and like I think about school and how kids, Muslim kids are, how they're just talked about during Ramadan and when they're fasting during the day. So instead of having a universal approach to children's religious practices, we do a lot of accommodations. And what that means is children who are Muslim, who are fasting, often find themselves isolated during school lunches. So instead of designing a structure, an approach to education where we're thinking about, okay, how can we make sure every child is safe and happy? We say, okay, let's make sure these kids are fed. Let's take care of these kids who aren't eating. And I think what we're starting to go through now, and it's very, very hard. I mean, teaching is a massive workforce, millions of teachers. It's giant, lots and lots of teachers split by state lines, and we don't have a national system. And so every time we try to make change, we're battling all of that history. It's just so much on the coattails or on the on the hems of education of teachers today, that every time we try to make change, there's almost always something pulling back because the weight of those historical decisions and our lack of a universal approach to education that we designed first and foremost for the non-disabled sons of men with access to power. And then we add on other groups of people, that we haven't had a restart moment.
I think that's a great way of understanding it, that everything is, that our education system is tacked together as different peoples are included in what is meant by public education or what is meant by education. And at different locations and at different times, different people are added on, but it's never rethought. The entire system is never rethought. It's always, how do we now tack something on that will include these people or whatnot. To get back a little bit to the idea of rhetoric and language, what are some of, and if you want to go into some of the things that this shapes today, you can, but certainly don't have to. What are some of maybe the more interesting debates or topics based around masculine rhetoric or white rhetoric, or any of those that you would point to say this is how you can see that this occurs and matters?
So I think one of my favorite sort of idioms or quotes that I heard someone say once is that the great work of America is persuading white men to change their minds. And a great deal of teaching is persuading men with acts in power to change their position. So what we see a lot is teachers using idioms and persuasive language that's shaped in masculine norms as a way to appeal to masculine leaders. So we'll see teachers talk about, oh, we're in the trenches and they're not, or talking about being on the front lines. And at the same time, they'll also use touchstones that appeal to that speak to what people think teachers' job is as women's calling. We see that a lot when people talk about how, in 100 years, it won't matter what my job was, what my car was. It won't matter my bank account. What'll matter is that I was a teacher and I touched a child's heart or whatever. Or teaching is a calling, and speaking about teachers as heroes, and this kind of idea that what teachers are doing is something that's innate, as opposed to being members of a trained professional class. Most teachers have their masters. That is the common is, like I said, the average teacher is a 45-year-old woman with her master's and a bachelor's of science. So this idea that it's the work of trying to change minds. And which isn't to say that all teachers are trying to change positions. There are a lot of teachers, especially white men, who subscribe to the gendered role of teaching, that they see themselves as working in a calling. They see themselves as, well, when you teach, you show up, 6:30 pre-COVID, you start at 6:30 and you stay until you're done at the end of the day. Or there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing that. And I think it's always very, very tough to kind of negotiate the conversations, because we have to hold in our minds that white women are both subject to institutional sexism, which is why we needed collective bargaining in order to get parity in salaries and job protections, but can be those who are advocating racist or ableist or homophobic or transphobic systems inside the school. And so it's white women teachers who will, in one breath, speaking collectively, will say, teachers are underappreciated in America and what we do is so important and we need to be valued. It's a calling, it's a life's work. But in the next breath, scold a trans child for wanting to use the bathroom of their gender. So talking about changing teaching is constantly about fighting on a whole bunch of different fronts, as I use a military analogy. And it cannot be stressed enough, the unintended consequences of not having a national education system. That means that teachers in some states in the Northeast are paid sometimes as twice as much as teachers who use collective bargaining but are in southern states. Yes, the cost of living is different, but also we're much more likely to be in a union up here in the Northeast than you are in the South. And there are several states that are hire and fire at will, which means the teacher has no union protection, which means they have no access to collective bargaining. So we can't talk with one voice. There is no teacher voice in America. There is even NEA and AFT, the two national unions, are dealing with all the local complexities and dealing with all of those kind of tensions. So when they do try to talk with one voice, the NEA tries to make a call there was some discussion a while back about the possibility of a national teacher strike, because no one knew what school was going to be like. in what the consequences were going to be. And there's a lot of pediatricians saying, or were saying then, things have changed a bit, about saying, kids need to go back to school. It's best for kids if kids go back to school and kids don't spread it. So pediatricians were speaking up. We weren't hearing from obstetricians and, like what cancer doctors are called, but we weren't hearing from doctors who take care of pregnant people what the consequences of being exposed to COVID were going to be, or if they were saying people who can get pregnant should go back to work. So it's never just one conversation. Whenever we're talking about anything related to American education, past or present, we're having 4 different conversations at the same time, because it's impossible just to talk about one thing, because it's American, it's localized by state, it's localized by district, there's the gender, there's the race, there's ableism. It's always multiple fronts at the same time. And so when we have the rhetorical debate, it's always very confusing.
Yeah, certainly. And at the same time, it also seems that it's a location for societal or cultural debate, because you have different groups who see it, some seeing it as a place for reforming, as we've talked about before, reforming society, and others seeing it very much as a place to maintain current systems in society. So that also adds to those struggles, because everything becomes about what do we see
absolutely.
America as.
And also, what do we define as political? So there's a whole slew of Americans who think schools shouldn't be political. And every time someone says that to me, I want to be like, the fact that a teacher who uses a wheelchair can get herself into her school building, that is political. Her mere body is political. A teacher teaching while 9 months pregnant is political. So when a teacher says there's no politics in my classroom, I'm like, no, there are. The fact that you're in a classroom is political. That it's always so fascinating. I'm always struck by why people try to insist we can keep politics out of education when we can't. We know how to teach nonpartisan. That's something that hasn't been an issue until, for years and years and years, there were debates about politics, but how to teach in a nonpartisan way. I mean, I remember reading one of my books is about teachers during the Kennedy era, and how what it was like to teach about Kennedy while Kennedy was in office, and how to do it in a nonpartisan way. And teachers struggled with it, but they figured it out. They could talk about politics without talking about the partisanship. But the reason it's so hard in the modern era is because of the stark difference between the parties. So if a teacher talks about, a trans person, or reads a book about how Molly has 2 mommies, that becomes partisan, but that's simply because of the gap between the parties, or it's perceived as partisan. And that's not something the teacher has done. That's how the public perceives the difference between politics and partisan. So language is such a huge part of how we talk about education.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I want to ask one final question, and it's rather open-ended. It's as you look at American education and its history, what one thing would you say is most important for Americans to understand about the system when approaching their ideas about it, when approaching teachers, when approaching administrators, and approaching the politics of education? What do we need to understand about education history?
I think the piece that I would advocate that most Americans understand is that even how we understand the history of education is constantly changing. And that's because of our changes around historiography and who does history. So if you read a history of education book, a history of education textbook from the 1930s, and for a brief spell, history of education was a topic high schoolers in New York State could take an exam in order to graduate from high school. So you could take a class in history of education, and there was a textbook and there was an exam. And the textbooks were written by non-disabled cis white men talking about the moves of non-disabled cis white men throughout American education history. So you'd see a lot about Horace Mann, not a lot about Catherine Beecher. You'd see a lot about, Dewey, and not a lot about Anna Julia Cooper. But recently, we're starting to shift our understanding of the historical record. We're finding new ways to think about the actual pedagogy of what teachers do. So there's been a few books written about how teachers taught back in those eras, but the historical record wasn't understood in the same way it is now that women's history is its own field. So I think what we have to think about when you think about American education history is you have to be willing to complicate the narrative. And if someone offers you a simple narrative about American education history, they're peddling something, or they're trying to use propaganda. We have to understand there isn't a single narrative. So whenever somebody says American schools were too, no, they're just trying to sell you something. If someone isn't willing to speak to the complex nature of it, to speak to the multiple tracks, to speak to the fact that it wasn't until 1975 that kids with disabilities were legally allowed to get an education, or the states was required to give them an education. If they want to start talking about the system was designed, or this is why we have schools, they might be putting forth an argument, but I would advocate that we have to be willing to challenge simplified narratives around American education history, around any history, frankly, but especially around American education history. We have to be able to name who we're talking about. Are we talking about white women teachers? Are we talking about the white men administrators? Are we talking about the activism by Black Southern teachers? Are we talking about, the work by, Asian teachers on the West Coast in the 1930s and all of the work that they were trying to do? The history of the teachers in the internment camps during World War II is a different history than the teachers in suburban New York State districts. And I would just advocate for complicate the narrative. If anyone tries to give you a simplified narrative, push back and complicate it.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you, listeners, for listening to this Ask Historians podcast with Jenn Binis. I hope that you got a lot out of this, and that you will go and attempt to complicate the narrative by learning more about ed history. You can do that by looking at answers from Jenn, who's at Ed History 101. That's her username on Ask Historians. So you can look up some of her answers. And of course, you can also ask her on Ask Historians to give you some recommendations on books. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you, Ryan. This was such a gift. It was such a gift to be able to talk about something I love so much.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.